Were you here to talk about OpenCivic or technology decision making? Sounds good. Okay, cool. Hello.
How's it going?
Good. You're here to hear about OpenCivic or the other session?
Now.
Okay, excellent. So we can run this very informally, given that we have an overflowing room of thousands of people. But I'm going to tell you about a Drupal distribution that we've been working on that we're pretty excited about, which is called OpenCivic. And the goal of it really is to create a global marketplace for civic software. So what does that mean? Well, I worked in government from 2009 to 2011 and did a lot of work with Drupal, and our main issue at the time was that we had a terrible economy with falling budgets and we had increasing needs for government services. And one of the few ways that we thought we could potentially provide better government at lower cost was to get involved in what we think of as civic technology innovation. So this is the stuff that Code for America and now other organizations in other parts of the world like Code for Europe engage in, is getting tech talent to go into governments to help governments innovate affordably with technology. So this takes many forms: hackathons like the World Bank's Sanitation Hackathon, app contests like New York City's Big Apps Contest, the Code for America Fellows Program, as I mentioned, challenge.gov here in DC at the federal level. These are all efforts to try to foster civic technology innovation as a way to help government do more with less. This has resulted in a whole lot of application development in a bunch of different realms. One most notable, I think, is 3-on-1, the service request system, where you call a phone number 3-on-1 and say, hey, there's a problem on my street, to your city government, and then they track that as a service request and come and fix it, hopefully. There's really been a burgeoning development of hundreds of apps for 3-on-1, so that instead of going to a company and buying a 3-on-1 solution as a government, certainly you can do that, but you also can say, you know what, this is just data, and citizens and government officials alike want this data in a bunch of different forms. So whether it's mapping your 3-on-1 service requests to figure out how to better deploy limited city resources, like where are the most potholes, where are the most cats that get stuck in a tree, where are the most noise complaints in the city. 3-on-1 data can help you improve your government operations and deploy your limited resources in a more strategic way if you can analyze that data. So that's a use case that people have built some apps for. Just making it easy to submit a 3-on-1 service request from a phone as a citizen on a street of a neighborhood is another one that people have built a lot of apps for. Long story short, there are literally hundreds of apps that have been built around 3-on-1 data. And the great news is that for a lot of them, governments didn't actually have to pay for them or develop them themselves because they were built by civic hackers. So that's just one example, but across a whole range of civic use cases like 3-on-1, there's just a burgeoning ecosystem, hundreds of cities in the US alone that have contributed to the building of thousands of apps using literally hundreds of thousands of public open data sets as inputs to and outputs from these apps. So cities are really innovating a lot in technology and involving sort of civic hackers who may or may not work for those governments in that process. So that's all great. Drupal, of course, has a long history of collaboration, and the Drupal for Government community in particular, which I've been involved with for a long time, has a track record of actually publishing code, right? On GitHub, on Drupal.org. The White House, for example, put out modules that it funded the development of on Drupal.org, released them as open source, shared them with other governments like the one that I worked for in New York State. We actually used and benefited from White House's contribution of modules to Drupal.org. Vice versa, we published as New York State government modules up to Drupal.org that are used by other governments. So again, Drupal as a community, and the Drupal for Government community in particular, has a long track record of actually collaborating on the development of civic software in the context of Drupal. So I guess my take home from that is that if you're going to get involved in civic hacking and cities helping cities and governments helping governments, people who already know how to work collaboratively within Drupal are some of the best people potentially to do some of that work. Just one more thing about sort of the White House's contributions in this regard. The White House has built sites that have gotten millions of Americans engaged, like the We the People petitions site, and they haven't stopped there. They've actually turned sites like that into Drupal distributions that can be then reused so that another government could say, well, I want the White House petitions functionality, but I don't want it to look or feel like the White House. I want it to look like my city. So we worked on a white label theme for the White House petitions distribution so that it's easier for a government to say, okay, I'm Hampton Roads, Virginia. I want a petition site you can start with something that's white label and available on Drupal.org without any of the White House branding or the White House specific functionality. So Drupal distributions, again, are a great way to share and collaborate on code, and Drupal distributions are contributing significantly to the huge adoption of Drupal by governments literally all over the world. So why is that a great idea? Well, we know that Drupal distributions are great in the Drupal community because they help us do more faster. They help us take advantage of work that other people in governments and companies have put in to get what we need at lower cost. And I think it's interesting to think about, so when Drupal is deployed widely across a lot of governments and when other civic apps are being developed by a whole bunch of governments, what the potential aggregate savings could be if we truly optimally shared each other's work and shared each other's code rather than building our own custom solutions for our own custom needs or buying the same solution many times over. There's some sort of big number estimates in general about technology sharing just at the federal level about how much money could be saved by optimizing the sharing of technology at the federal level. That's not just specific to open source software or even software, but I guess the point is that there's a lot of inefficiency in terms of the way that all governments procure and manage both hardware and software in government, and that there's a thought that by sharing resources, including software better, we could save a lot of money in the aggregate, particularly if we think about all the levels of government, local, state, federal, national, the different branches of government, legislative, executive, judiciary, and the different themes. Like if there's a transit organization at the federal level and a transit agency in New York City and a transit agency in New York State, chances are they have some of the same data and the same use cases they need to deal with. It'd be great if one of them built a great solution for one of their needs, that it'd be easy and intuitive for the other of them to find that and take advantage of it. So making that happen is really the main reason that we're here, that I'm here today, and going to talk to you about a Drupal distribution called OpenCivic. The potential is this sort of open city idea. You can replace open state or open country if you want conceptually, but it's this burgeoning civics hacking software movement. On the other hand, the reality is that most government software projects today still look kind of like this. They're managed in spreadsheets. They have a waterfall project management process. They are built highly custom without much of an eye towards how the next department in the next building over in the same government might be able to use or benefit from it, let alone how my peers in another state or another country might be able to take advantage of what I'm about to invest in as a government. And we're trying to turn that around so that the open collaborative software development process where we're really sharing off and leveraging off of each other's work can become the rule, not the exception. And what does that make possible? Well, big picture, the idea is that we want to sort of create a distributed innovation cycle that includes citizens and communities, government, and industry, and have innovation be able to happen in any of those places, and have it not really matter where it happens. Know that each of these other sectors are going to be able to take advantage of it. And we've seen this to some degree in data with weather and GPS, right? That's a big shared technology asset, which is very mature and is why we can all figure out where we're going on our phones these days. We're seeing it now, as I mentioned, in Open 3.1, and we're seeing it in content management systems for government with the wide adoption of Drupal. And I think there's a whole bunch of other civic software domains where this may take hold, and we want to help make that happen. So how do we foster reuse of software? How do we make it so that if, again, Hampton Roads, Virginia figures something out, Kansas City, Missouri can take advantage of it? Well, for software to be shared, people have to know that it exists. It's sort of a fundamental thing. The Apple App Store is a instructive example, I think, that the incredible adoption of apps on iPhones is significantly driven by your ability to find them in an app store. We looked at that model and said, okay, in government, we need something like that. We need an app store for government. So I wrote a blog post in 2010 about that, and a bunch of other people had similar ideas at the same time, and we created an idea called CfA Commons and got a little bit of funding for it. It's now been subsumed under Code for America, and it's called Code for America Commons. And very simply, it's an app catalog that shows you what governments are using what applications where. And it gives you a lot of metadata about that. So you can go in, you can search on an application, like say, one of these hundreds of Open 3.1 applications that I mentioned, and find what your peers are using. And get very simple search results listing. You can see where these are being used. So this application called Mind Mixer is deployed in all these places around the country. And there's metadata specifically about who's using it and where. And you can write your own case studies. You can add your own stories about what's working and where to this. And of course, you can share it easily on the social web. And it's it's collaborative. You can edit these descriptions. It sort of works like a wiki in that sense. And the idea is, again, if I'm using software somewhere in government, to be able to share that information with my peers in a way that they can benefit from knowledge about my experience with it. So that's cool, and that's happening here in the US. The World Bank down the street got excited about this idea and invested with us in building a Drupal distribution around this idea, which we call OpenCivic. And the idea is that it shouldn't be limited to the US context to have an app catalog for government, but that's relevant really worldwide. And so that was the genesis of a reusable Drupal distribution so that other places could also have an app catalog. Just quickly, in case anyone doesn't know what a Drupal distribution is, very simply, it's a way it's a configuration of Drupal that gets you to solve a particular kind of need faster, rather than starting from scratch with Drupal and saying, okay, I have to put together all the pieces that I want. Drupal distribution says, well, I want an app catalog, or I want an e-commerce store, or I want a White House petition site, and it kind of gives you that out of the box with Drupal. And then you can then customize it and change it, but it's a jumpstart, essentially. So the apps catalog distro, or Drupal distribution, or what we're calling OpenCivic, which is online at drupal.org/project/OpenCivic, has sort of three main concepts in it. Applications, software, organizations that have either created or are using software, and deployments, which are the instances of a specific application used by a specific organization in a specific place. And that's what we call a deployment. So an application is all these fields of data, key features, a logo, a homepage, a demo if there's a demo online, a rating, screenshots, vendors that might be providing support, really important information that I would need as a government technology buyer or a developer for a government to find an application and say, okay, does this look like what I need or not? So that's what an application is. An organization is a company, a government agency, a nonprofit, what have you, that is using a piece of software. So again, very simply, what experiences have this organization what applications does this organization have experience with? What kind of organization is it? Is it a government? Is it a local government, etc.? Where am I located, so that perhaps somebody could get in touch with me if they want to know more about my experience with a particular application. And again, a deployment is the cross-section of an application and an organization that's actually used it. So that's application, organization, who the developers were on it, if you want to add that, and basically a simple case study of how did this use of this application work? Did it go well? Did it not go well? And so the idea is that when you have that information as a government technology buyer looking for new software, that's really important metadata for me to have to help me decide, is this something that might fit for me or not? So that's OpenCivic Drupal distribution in the context of creating a civic app store or application catalog. There's another context in which people are using OpenCivic, which seems quite different at first blush, but it actually is quite related, and that is for hackathons. So, for example, for the World Bank Sanitation Hackathon, sanitationhackathon.org, they used OpenCivic to not only create and store data about applications, but about problems, civic problems, and solutions to those problems. In this case, problems relating to sanitation, and literally, with taxonomies for things like open defecation and things that we don't normally run into in government here, but that are really relevant in other parts of the world. So what a hackathon use of OpenCivic provides is the ability to describe problems and projects that are intended to address those problems and the teams that are working on those problems. But the outcome of that is an application, ideally, right? If you get people together for a hackathon for a weekend, you don't just want to talk about a problem, you actually want to create a solution, and in many cases that turns into an application. The problem, though, in the case of hackathons, often is that once you spend a weekend together working on an application, you all go home and you go back to your day job and nobody remembers it, let alone comes in to improve it, let alone provides support for it to another government, such that the government might say, hey, I can actually just use this as a commercial product, open source or otherwise. So we think it's important to connect hackathons where problems get addressed by the building of new applications with application catalogs, where somebody who's not interested in the hacking part of it, interested just in using it and benefiting from it, is more likely to find it. So that's why we built one Drupal distribution that can address application catalogs and hackathon use cases. One of the things this might enable, for example, is getting better return on investment. There's a lot of time and money invested in hackathons. Just the first week of June, the National Day of Civic Hacking was run in 100 cities concurrently around the country. That's a lot of time and a lot of money invested. And if the outcomes of these hackathons don't really ever see the light of day, there's a concern on the part of a lot of funders that it's just not worth it. Hopefully by getting the outcomes of hackathons into application catalogs where they're more likely to be found and used and reused and improved upon, we can actually demonstrate that hackathons actually do provide a sustainable return on investment. So, okay, if you buy everything I've just said about how there's value in having this data about what applications are working where in government available, there leads to some second order questions, like should there be one big catalog for government applications everywhere in the world? When we first started out, we thought maybe naively that might be the answer, that I just want one place to go to. I want to see how many cities are using Drupal, and I want a really quick answer to that. And then how many cities are using Drupal for a transit application, be able to drill in like that. That sounds really efficient and great to me as a prospective government technology buyer. However, we as a small company, and we made Drupal OpenCivic available on Drupal.org, started getting approached by a whole range of organizations, towns, nonprofit organizations, other countries, saying, no, we want our own app store. We don't want an app store that is owned by somebody else. We don't want the terms that are relevant, the taxonomies that are relevant to New York City, totally not relevant to my nonprofit in Brazil, for example. Or the World Bank even coming to us and saying, we want a sanitation application context. We want taxonomies like that include terms like open defecation, not very relevant to New York City transit, for example. So we arrived at the realization that people want a context in which they can share information about the applications they're using in a way that they can control. So New York City, for example, wants an app catalog that is just for apps developed inside New York City, and not even sure they want to share that information with other cities. Now, we wish they should, we wish they would, but the status quo today is that the New York City Department of Environmental Protection has no idea what the New York City Department of Transit is using in terms of software, as amazing as that sounds. So the chance of them actually getting developers together to say, hey, we're working on a similar need here, let's team up on it, or instead of building two different things in two different ways and investing in it twice, let's actually get together and aggregate our talent or aggregate our investment in it. It's just not happening. So even at the very local level within a single city, an application catalog can really help with that. So we're both resigned to and also excited about the fact that there need to be a lot of civic app stores in the world, we think. And obviously there are a lot of hackathons in the world, and so when you add that use case to the mix, it's clear we think that there are going to be hundreds of these sites that have this kind of metadata. So that leads to, how could you potentially share data between all these app catalogs? And I'll get into that in a minute, because we still want to be able to ideally answer questions like, which cities are using Drupal for transit applications, and have some of that data come from New York City app catalog, some of that data come from a Code for America Commons catalog, some of that data come from a Code for Europe catalog. And so we're architecting this to make that technologically possible. Speaking of Europe, Code for Europe just deployed OpenCivic as their app catalog for Europe. It's a combination of Code for Europe, My Society in the UK, another organization called FutureGov and the Local Government Association, and it's europecommons.org. And it looks somewhat like the Code for America Commons application catalog, but with a different look and feel and some different features, some different terms, but the underlying Drupal distribution and the way that it's done and the schema for the metadata about apps and organizations and deployments, or what they call stories, is the same, so that data potentially could be federated from europecommons.org and commons.codeforamerica.org. You may be able to bring that data together and answer aggregate questions like, again, what cities are using Drupal for transit applications worldwide. At least that's the idea. Just one more example of how this is burgeoning. The National Day of Civic Hacking, which I mentioned, used OpenCivic to organize these 100-odd hackathons around the country. And an interesting thing there is that we realized out of this that it was really important to also add data sets to this, because you can have problems and you can have people that have good ideas for how to solve those problems with an application, but often if you don't have data to go along with it, the best application idea in the world and the best code in the world isn't really very useful. For example, if you're going to work on public defecation as an issue, and you want to, say, build an app that makes it easy for somebody to send a text message to find out where the nearest public toilet is, unless you have data about where those toilets are, that application is not going to be very useful. So we added data sets as a feature in publishing open data in a standards compliant way, so you can relate problems, solutions, teams, applications, and data in a way that is structured and transparent. This is now taken off worldwide. Code for Kenya, Code for Africa, developing the Caribbean, an organization called Avina down in Latin America. They're all deploying OpenCivic-based app catalogs to be repositories for their metadata about the apps that they're using where. So this is really becoming a worldwide thing. This is the roadmap for the distribution. We've already talked about application catalog and applications, organizations, and deployments, and hackathons, problem statements, projects, and teams. Data sets, adding data to it. Some other community features. Where this is going, we think, in the future is expanding to address app contests as well. So like New York City Big Apps or even challenge.gov could potentially be implemented. That kind of thing could be implemented with OpenCivic. Another thing that's happening is while we think it's really useful to get data about applications and how they're being used where, the next step for a government technology buyer to actually figure out if something is something they want or not would be to be able to try it out very easily. So Civic Sandboxes is an idea of connecting an application in one of these catalogs to a one-click cloud demo that you could spin up on the fly and then actually test the application yourself. Amazingly enough, even again in New York City, where I've done a lot of work, it takes about 5 weeks from a developer saying, hey, I want a Linux server on our own New York City infrastructure to test this cool application that I just found in this catalog. It takes about 5 weeks from requesting that to actually getting the server. So if you're looking to foster civic tech innovation, that's not a very good way to do it. You really do need to get cloud resources in the mix, in our opinion. So because of that, we're excited about a bunch of new initiatives that hold that potential. AWS, Amazon, just launched their City on a Cloud service last week. DCAN, another one of our Drupal distributions, is part of it. And what it is literally a one-click setup for an instance of an open source application on the Amazon cloud that you can test out for 24 hours, so for free. So you can imagine that that's not a big leap between that and actually having that same Drupal distribution DCAN in an app catalog that you can then have a link to spin up that one-click demo of on Amazon's cloud, and of course any other cloud service that you can imagine could also offer the same thing. So with that, we think we would have reduced the setup barrier and the discovery barrier to civic software to a great degree. So I will leave it there. Thank you for your attention, and invite any questions or feedback.
Yeah, I've got a question.
Yeah.
With this much exposure, or looking at all these different cities' needs and so forth, are you getting a sense of commonalities in terms of what kind of content endures and lives on, has value, and what kind fades away? And is there any kind of model that you sort of are able to store and pass on that way?
So really good question. It's basically about, can we actually get insights out of the use of the
how to run a city?
Yeah, exactly.
With data.
Who's using what where? That can be in terms of software applications. That can be in terms of data sets.
Right.
It could even be in terms of workflows and processes and policies you can imagine. So I'd say not yet. This is pretty early days. I mean, the first instance of OpenCivic went live just a few months ago. So we're very early yet. But all this metadata about what's being used where is now being captured and collected, and we do it, by the way, in a way that aligns with the schema.org schema for the description of applications and organizations, so that search engines have a very easy time understanding the data which is being created in these app catalogs. And I do think that holds the potential to do some really good analysis about what is working, what's not working, in a way that you could then use as a how-to manual for a new city, for example, that wants to overhaul its technology practices, to say, oh, this looks like my city here's what I'm going to do. Here's what I'm going to invest in. Here's what I'm going to buy. Here's what I'm going to, what skill sets in terms of software and language I'm going to hire developers for. I do think it has that kind of potential, and we're pretty excited about that. It may well not be us who answers that kind of question. It may be, PhD students researching. It may be companies like Amazon that see business opportunity. But having this structured data being captured somewhere in a way that it adheres to a schematic standard with schema.org standard makes that possible. And I think there's huge potential to drive efficiencies in especially local government as a result.
Okay.
So, yeah. Any other thoughts or questions?
So
Yeah.
you're erring on the side of many app catalogs, like you're sort of where you're thinking right now?
Yep. I don't know if you were here when I was going through it, but we initially had the other bias. We thought, why not one catalog to rule them all, and that seems efficient. We realized that for a lot of reasons that wasn't practical. And I'll just list a couple of them again. Some organizations want this to be done, but just within their organization for stuff they never intend to release out to the world, but still they want to share the knowledge about what software in a big organization like New York City is working and how it's going. Now we, of course, our bias is we wish they would release all that software, but as a practical matter, that's not happening yet. Another reason is just language differences. While Drupal certainly supports multilingual quite nicely, you can imagine that there are a lot of applications that are described a certain way in one language that, if translated, might be a lot of noise relative to signal for somebody in a completely different part of the world in a completely different thematic domain and with a different language looking for it. And I think the biggest thing is that there's a sense of ownership and trust and localization if you give somebody an open tool to solve their own localized need, but also make it such that the data that's in that catalog can be discovered and federated more broadly. So I think the aggregations are going to happen through, there's an API in this. I think that the federations of data are going to happen by third parties that want to answer a specific question, like who's using Drupal in transit in the world, rather than a single big app catalog that we're going to get all government technologists in the world to use. So yes. So I see a lot of geographically local catalogs, also a lot of thematically local catalogs, and then a lot of event-specific catalogs, more typically in the hackathon case, but with the underlying data and content types and schema and everything being consistent and shared among them. Yeah?
Are you aware of any of those thematic groups that the federal government's sponsoring or involved in?
So there's a lot of government investment in Drupal. Obviously, that's a thematic group in terms of like the particular software platform involved. There's a lot of sharing going on between Drupal users and the federal government and between different levels of government. There are a lot of software challenges that are sponsored by government, like NASA has sponsored the Space Apps Challenge for several years, which has developed apps for both user data and also in some cases meet some of their needs. And challenge.gov more broadly puts out a lot of challenges, many of them not related to or solvable by software, to crowdsource solutions to those challenges. So there's certainly interest in it. I think it's far from being systematized, and I think one of the things we hope to make easier is to really affordably try something and figure out if it worked or not, and then hopefully that'll engender additional investment in terms of sharing. Transit is one where I see a lot of good stuff happening and tends to be out in the sort of innovation leading edge in terms of data sharing and data standards. I think it's probably going to go the same way in terms of software. But I'd say it's early days on that. Yeah. Anybody else? All right, well, thank you so much for your attention. And the cards if anybody needs it. And thanks for showing up.